Hello and welcome to another episode of Ticket Booth to Vocal Booth. I'm Brandon and today we're going to be reviewing Evil Dead Rise. So the Evil Dead franchise has always been kind of interesting to me. I was one of those individuals who kind of fell into it through Army of Darkness back in the 90s. My dad rented it. We just thought it looked like a quirky horror comedy movie and knew nothing of the fact that it was supposed to be Evil Dead 3 or, The Medieval Dead or Evil Dead 1300, which, those titles probably would have helped people realize that it was a sequel, but I think Universal was kind of hoping that people would just watch it blind, but that's neither here nor there. And then, of course, years later, we got the Evil Dead remake in 2013, and then Ash vs. Evil Dead after that. So that brings us now to Evil Dead Rise. That being said, I enjoyed this. I do feel like it was a hair overhyped, though. I probably shouldn't be using that term, but I am someone who was fond of the 2013 remake, and I do feel like, I don't want to say I'm in the minority with that, because there are still a lot of people who enjoyed that one, but I feel like it's for like every two people who enjoyed that, one person hated it. A lot of people thought it was an in-name only cash grab. I'm like, I don't know, I feel like the remake definitely hit a lot of the same notes as the original in a good way. Evil Dead Rise, it does feel similar to the remake in tone. Granted, both those movies feel similar in tone to the original Evil Dead, which a lot of people tend to forget was a serious horror film, or at least was trying to be a serious horror film. I always said that the original Evil Dead was a straight horror film. Evil Dead 2 was horror with comedy, and then Army of Darkness was comedy with horror. And then I feel like Ash vs. Evil Dead kind of tried to toe the line between all three tones, and for the most part did pretty well. And then the Evil Dead remake went right back to the original tone, as does Evil Dead Rise. That being said, one thing I do appreciate about the film is that it definitely tries to stray away from the cabin in the woods trope. The opening sequence kind of taps into that, but then after that we go into a completely different setting, the high-rise apartment building, hence the title Evil Dead Rise. It's a pun. They still somehow managed to create that sense of claustrophobia and the lack of ability to escape. There are nice nods to the original Evil Dead, and rather than having a bridge that you can't cross, there's another way that they're trapped in the building, because most of the events take place in the I think on the 14th floor. So it's like, well, how do you do that? Like, you can't use the elevator, you can't use the stairs, what's going on? No, they have an answer for that. It makes sense. But that being said, if you're more of a fan of like Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness and that style of Evil Dead film, your mileage may vary with this one. If you're more fond of the original Evil Dead, the Evil Dead remake, I think you're going to get more out of this as well. That being said, I'm not rating it quite yet. This would be a very short episode. But basically, I'm just kind of giving my own, thoughts on the franchise as a whole and where I've personally come from with it. But I feel like an Evil Dead film is only as good as its prime Deadite. Alyssa Sutherland as the mother who gets possessed first, who becomes like the primary Deadite, for lack of a better term. She definitely carries quite a bit of the film. And I do hope we can see more of her in the future. But the cast as a whole did pretty well. I think the biggest difference between this and other films in the franchise is the fact that you have children in the crossfire. And I mean like actual children, not like college kids like the original Evil Dead, even though I think like 2 or 3 of those cast members were already in their late 20s by the time they filmed that. While I think Bruce Campbell and Ellen Sandweiss were the 2 youngest ones in that cast, if I'm not mistaken, like between like 19 and 22, I think. But no, like actual underage children are in the crossfire, which is, I don't think that's completely new. I want to say that might have popped up in something. I'm drawing a blank, like possibly in Ash vs. Evil Dead. It's actually been a while since I've watched Ash vs. Evil Dead. I feel like I've watched the movies more recently than I have Ash vs. Evil Dead. But yeah, that being said, the sister to Alyssa Sutherland's character, it's hard to say. I forgot the character's name. She's like the primary protagonist. She sort of takes on almost like an Ellen Ripley style approach to the character over the course of the film, with the youngest child being almost like her Newt, as a reference to Aliens, because I was definitely getting that Ripley and Newt vibe with the 2 characters over the course of the film. Definitely some pretty good gore effects in there. I do think this might be the first Evil Dead film that wasn't in some shape or form warned that it would have an NC-17 if it wasn't cut. Like, even Army of Darkness, as lighter as that one was, there was one shot that had to be cut to avoid an NC-17 at the time, because, in the early 90s, the MPAA was a little more strict with violence in films, and so there's literally one shot of blood splashing on a stone wall in the pit in the opening of Army of Darkness that had to be cut. It was like a 1-second shot that would actually seem very tame by today's standards. But I do remember the 2013 Evil Dead remake actually had to be cut to avoid an NC-17. In fact, in recent years, that unrated version has been released. But yeah, even the original Evil Dead basically decided to go unrated rather than have an X rating. And then Universal apparently got the rights to the original Evil Dead to do a re-release, not realizing that it was going to get an NC-17 in 1994, I believe. So Universal never bothered actually releasing it because they knew in the 90s an NC-17 was a hard death knell for the box office. And even nowadays, you don't really see the NC-17 very often. So, but it's kind of weird to think that Evil Dead Rise actually almost began life as an HBO Max exclusive, or, Max, as it's going to be called now. But for the most part, I feel like I'm kind of droning on in circles. I do apologize. I've had like a day to actually kind of mull over everything with this film. That being said, if you're an Evil Dead fan, I think you're going to enjoy this. General horror fans, I think they have been lacking, decent R-rated horror films for a while. I know Scream 6 recently came out. That got a lot of good buzz. I actually have not seen a new Scream film since Scream 3. I'm way off the bandwagon on that one. I need to give the newer trilogy a shot. But as for Evil Dead Rise, what would I rate this one? I think when all said and done, I was kind of hemming and hawing back and forth between two possible ratings, but I think at the end of the day, it gets the job done of being an Evil Dead film. It has good gore, good atmosphere, interesting characters, brings in the classic chainsaw, of course. And yeah, I think it's a good modern Evil Dead film, and I think out of 5 VOMOs, I would give this 3.5. I think that's a respectable level to land on. I'm curious to see what happens next in the Evil Dead franchise. Considering it took 10 years for another movie, although we did have Ash vs. Evil Dead in between the remake and Evil Dead Rise. Hopefully we don't have to wait another decade for another film. That being said, I don't know what continuity Evil Dead Rise would actually be considered to follow. I think they did that on purpose. I feel like you could either say this takes place after the remake or takes place after the original trilogy, Ash vs. Evil Dead. And of course, in this world of multiverses that we live in now, especially between Spider-Man No Way Home and the upcoming Flash film, when you deal with supernatural forces that can open portals and go through time, like Army of Darkness, anything's possible. So, that being said, as we wrap this one up, I don't know for sure what I'm going to be reviewing next. It might be Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. That's most likely next on my radar. I know I'm going to, try to see that one next week, and we'll take it from there. But as always, if you have any questions about the VOMO or any of the products at Vocal Booth To Go, including our vocal condenser microphone on top of that, visit us at vocalbooth2go.com. And as always, I'll see you at the movies.